So this is the problem that the Christian has to contend with. How can God permit such insidious levels of unthinkable suffering?
Cosmic Skeptic published a video in which he claims that animal suffering is Christianity's biggest problem. In building his case, Alex ended up directly contradicting the core idea behind his ethics. And so what I'm going to show you in this video is that in trying to go against Christianity, Alex has maneuvered himself straight into a dilemma that threatens to tear apart his very own worldview. Hi, my name is Lucas and this is my channel Deflate, which challenges skeptics, strengthens believers and creates a space for awesome discussions about God. Before we get started, let me point out that I've already responded to Alex's case in this video up here. There I showed that evolutionary theory and Cosmic Skeptic's very own line of reasoning surprisingly flip his biggest case against Christianity around into his biggest argument for it. Yes, I know, this sounds like a pretty bold claim, so go and watch for yourself why this is so. Now, I think that the video you're watching now is actually more important than my first response, because the case I'm building here, if successful, will put Alex's worldview into far greater trouble than my previous argument. So I'm excited to have you join me and I hope you'll enjoy the ride. We'll start with a short recap of Cosmic Skeptic's argument. Alex essentially claims that the existence of an all-powerful and all-loving God is implausible given the horror and violence wild animals have to endure.
They suffer from predation by other animals. Wild dogs disembowel their prey. Venomous snakes cause slow internal bleeding and paralysis. Crocodiles drown large animals in their jaws.
While the topic of predation is a key element in Alex's case, it's not the only one.
Right, and animals also suffer from rampant disease, dehydration, and starvation. They have to contend with forest fires and floods and a whole manner of other terrifying natural disasters.
There is also an explicitly numerical dimension to Alex's argument as he points to the sheer amount of animals that are suffering.
We're talking trillions of animals, each one of whom will, under the unerring supervision of an all-powerful, all-loving God, likely experience more fear, devastation, and suffering in their lifetimes than we human beings are even capable of imagining.
Thus, the problem of animal suffering is, according to Alex, even bigger than the problem of human suffering, or as he puts it,
if the problem of suffering is historically one of Christianity's biggest problems, then the problem of animal suffering is its biggest.
This is Alex's argument in a nutshell. As mentioned, Alex introduces his case by placing the problem of animal suffering alongside the problem of human suffering. Elaborating on the latter, he says that,
now, as you'll probably already know, the most famous problem that you have, if you want to say that the Christian God, that is, an all-loving, all-powerful God, exists, is the positively colossal amount of suffering infused into the human experience.
He goes on to add that
suffering is so omnipresent that most of our time spent existing is time spent trying to avoid it.
It's key to understand what Alex means here. I might be wrong, but it really seems to me that by saying that suffering is so omnipresent, Alex does not describe the fact that people are suffering all over the world or in all sorts of countries, as in people are suffering everywhere. No, unless I misunderstand him, he seems to be saying that suffering is omnipresent in the life of every individual. That's why he goes on to say,
suffering is so omnipresent that most of our time spent existing is time spent trying to avoid it. Eating to avoid starvation, working to avoid poverty, sleeping to avoid fatigue.
It looks like Alex talks about you, me, and himself when he says that most of our time is spent trying to avoid suffering. But this also means that the omnipresence of that suffering applies not to its global distribution, or at least not primarily so, but to the supposedly all-encompassing extent to which it engulfs each one of us individually. Now, I don't know if Cosmic Skeptic really expects his viewers to be so non-skeptical and buy that every meal they eat and every coffee they drink is a matter of them avoiding starvation, or that enjoying sleeping in on Saturday morning is merely a matter of them avoiding fatigue. But given that his viewers have the luxury of watching YouTube videos instead of working 18 hours a day to earn not even $1, means that they're almost certainly not trying to avoid starvation when having a sandwich for lunch or when taking their girlfriend out for sushi. And so, with all due respect, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that Cosmic Skeptic is misconstruing reality, either consciously or unconsciously, which raises the question, why would he do that? Hold that thought. We will get back to this because there is more. Just as your existence and mine is, according to Alex, infused with the omnipresence of suffering, the experience of pain for animals isn't something that happens to them merely every now and then. No, it is an ever-present hallmark of animal life, which is why Alex says that
animals in the wild are subject to endless torment from all angles of their existence.
In fact, pain is so significant a feature of animal existence that it has to be considered the very thing that defines what it means to be an animal, as Alex states at the beginning of his case.
If human life is, as I've argued, infused with pain, then non-human animal life is defined by pain.
Now, as I have mentioned in my first video already, Alex's move to reduce animal life with all its complexities to this one single issue, pain, doesn't strike one for its nuance. I mean, just consider the following basic facts. Most animals are invertebrates, that is, they don't have a vertebral column or spine. In fact, as surprising as this may sound, invertebrates make up no less than 95% of the entire animal kingdom. Now, you have to know that there is a huge discussion going on among biologists about whether or not invertebrate animals can even feel pain, and if yes, if they feel it the way we do. In light of that, Alex's claim that non-human animal life is defined by pain seems disproportionate to the highest degree and completely defiant of where the scientific conversation is at. By the way, I'm not saying that 95% of all animals definitely don't feel pain. No. But what I am saying is that there is an ongoing scientific debate about this, and it's in light of that that Alex's claim of animal life being defined by pain is highly problematic and not what you would expect exactly of someone who embraces cosmic skepticism. And so, as is the case with his description of human life, Alex's elaborations on animal life seem to be out of touch with reality. I'll explain later why I believe him to be taking this route. But first, it's time for you to learn that even Alex himself doesn't actually see reality to be as bleak as he's made it to be in his biggest case against Christianity. And this is what will get us to the core of my critique. Let me explain. One of the foundations of Alex's ethics is the utilitarian idea that human beings are driven by the desire for pleasure. I have looked at Cosmic Skeptic's project to establish objectivist ethics in quite some detail. You can check out my response up here. This idea that we are geared towards maximizing our pleasure is absolutely key for Alex's ethical framework, which is why he says that everything you do is ultimately based in pleasure. Or, I know that anytime you do anything, you think that that's gonna maximize your pleasure. And that, as a matter of fact, I know that the reason you are doing anything is because you think it will maximize your pleasure. Like, necessarily. Now, just on a side note, I find it rather remarkable, again, that Alex can call himself a cosmic skeptic and also make such extraordinary claims to knowledge with matter-of-fact certainty. Be that as it may, it's not just that human beings are all about maximizing their pleasure, but all sentient creatures are. Here is how Alex himself condenses the foundation of his ethical theory with 100% concision.
Let me just clear things up as briefly as possible right here for you. Okay, I believe that it is objectively true that sentient creatures will always desire the maximization of their pleasure.
So let's get this straight. In building his biggest case against Christianity, Alex tells us that suffering is so omnipresent that most of our time spent existing is time spent trying to avoid it, and that non-human animal life is defined by pain. In contrast, the key idea behind his ethical theory is that everything you do is ultimately based in pleasure, and that it is objectively true that sentient creatures will always desire the maximization of their pleasure. Am I the only one who thinks that something is off here? I mean, in Alex's ethics, everything revolves around the maximization of pleasure. But in his biggest case against Christianity, Alex flips the whole thing upside down. He makes pain rather than pleasure the defining feature of animal existence and claims that what's omnipresent in humans is the experience of suffering, so much so, in fact, that while we're busy trying to avoid it, pleasure has fallen into utter oblivion. Now, Alex and his defenders will most probably object and say that he is being perfectly consistent, because avoiding pain and pursuing pleasure are simply two sides of one and the same coin. In fact, he mentions this exact point in his case for ethics when he says that pleasure can be thought of as the avoidance of pain. Is this the way out for Alex? No, not at all. On the contrary, it makes matters even worse. Let me explain why. For starters, I'm happy to grant that pleasure can be thought of as the avoidance of pain. However, this isn't actually relevant because Alex's ethics is not built on the idea that we desire pleasure, but that we desire the maximization of pleasure. And it doesn't fly to say that the maximization of pleasure can be thought of as the avoidance of pain, because it's simply not true that by virtue of avoiding pain, a creature is also maximizing its pleasure. A beggar may get soup in a soup kitchen and thus avoid the pain of hunger, but that doesn't mean he or she is maximizing the pleasure of eating the most delicious meal possible. Now, if avoiding pain and maximizing pleasure are not the same thing, then it also follows that the desire to avoid pain is not the same as the desire to maximize pleasure. Therefore, the drive which ultimately guides human beings, according to Alex's biggest case against Christianity, the desire to avoid suffering, is not the same as the drive that ultimately guides human beings, according to his ethics, the desire to maximize pleasure. Now, let's assume that it really is the case that human suffering is omnipresent and that animal life is defined by pain, as Alex claims in one video. Against this assumption, isn't it more plausible to define the avoidance of pain rather than the maximization of pleasure as the primary desire driving sentient beings? It sure seems so. Think of a person who starves, for example. Such a person is primarily concerned with getting anything to eat so that they can avoid the feeling of hunger. In contrast, a starving person is far less concerned, if concerned at all, with getting the most delicious dish ever so that they can maximize their culinary pleasures. Alex himself seems to agree with this line of reasoning, which is why in his case against Christianity, he pinpoints the avoidance of suffering as the primary concern which dictates how we spend most of our time existing. In principle, this view makes 100% sense. If we assume that our suffering is omnipresent, it is far more plausible to define as our primary desire the avoidance of suffering and not the maximization of pleasure. But now, wait, that's the exact opposite of what Alex told us in his ethical theory. There, he claimed that our primary desire is for the maximization of pleasure and not for the avoidance of pain. And we've just seen that these two are not the same thing. Something doesn't add up here, and it's this. On the one hand, Alex tells us that it is objectively true that sentient creatures will always desire the maximization of their pleasure. This makes sense if we hold that sentient beings are not experiencing constant suffering and pain, because if we were, we would be primarily concerned with alleviating that suffering, rather than with the maximization of pleasure. Yet, a picture of constant suffering is exactly what Alex presents us with in his biggest case against Christianity, in which he claims that animal life is defined by pain and that suffering is omnipresent in your life and mine. There, he himself is led to the conclusion that most of our time spent existing is time spent trying to avoid suffering. So which is it, Alex? Are sentient creatures in constant pain and thus driven by the desire to avoid it? Or are they driven by the desire to always maximize pleasure, which means that they are not in a situation of constant suffering? Even though we're by far not done yet, you can probably already see how Alex's worldview doesn't exactly make for a state-of-the-art example of internal coherence. But it gets even better, so let's keep going. It can be said that all other things being equal, the more intense the reality of suffering, the bigger the challenge for the Christian to defend his belief in the existence of an all-loving and all-powerful God, and the easier the task for the atheist to advance the argument that the existence of such a God is implausible. That's exactly what Alex himself captures when he lays out the stakes of his biggest case against Christianity. Listen closely to what he says.
What would we expect to find if we assume that there is no God, and animals in nature are just randomly mutating and evolving and competing for resources with no divine guidance? Well, we'd expect pretty much exactly what we observe in the real world, a messy bloodbath and a struggle for survival. Now, what would we expect to see if we assumed the existence of an all-loving and all-powerful God? Maybe some level of suffering that we might not be able to fully explain, but nothing even remotely approaching the level of horror and pain that actually exists in the natural world.
Did you catch that? Alex is not claiming that suffering per se is incompatible with the existence of God. No, what he is saying is that the amount of suffering we're witnessing is what makes the existence of God implausible. Alex's key issue is that the omnipresence of pain we're seeing is just over the top, which is why he concludes that
It is incalculably easier to account for this suffering on an atheistic worldview.
With this in place now, let me answer the question I asked before about why Alex so blatantly misconstrues reality in his supposedly biggest case against Christianity. This will at the same time explain why, in doing so, he also goes against his very own conviction about the maximization of pleasure that lies at the heart of his ethics. I believe that in seeking to bolster the atheist position over and against Christianity, Alex has either consciously or unconsciously painted a picture of the world that makes suffering far more prevalent than it actually is. In fact, he has made it to be nothing short of omnipresent in your life and in mine, and has chosen to make pain the ultimate feature that defines animal existence. However, in doing so, he didn't realize that his case ends up directly contradicting his ethical framework. Again, if sentient creatures are by definition constantly suffering, they will spend most of their time trying to avoid it. But if that's true, it cannot also be true that sentient creatures will always desire the maximization of their pleasure. Now, remember what I just said a minute ago. Alex admits that some level of suffering is what we can expect to see, even if we assumed the existence of an all-loving and all-powerful God. And so it seems that in an attempt to give atheism a leg up over and against Christianity, he artificially infused reality with additional suffering by redefining animal life exclusively in terms of pain, and by redefining the pleasure of having dinner into a matter of avoiding starvation. Now, when Alex concludes his argument from animal suffering by saying that it is incalculably easier to account for this suffering on an atheistic worldview, I'm the first to agree with this statement. The only problem is that what Alex's atheistic worldview is accounting for with such incalculable ease is not the real world Alex, you and I live in, but the fictional world he has construed for us with bloated levels of suffering. Now, am I saying that suffering doesn't exist and that it isn't a problem the Christian has to account for? No. Not at all. I'm happy to admit that the problem of suffering is the biggest problem the Christian has to contend with. However, making the problem of suffering bigger than it is, while also going against one's own matter-of-fact conviction that sentient existence is driven by the desire for the maximization of pleasure, and then moving on to say that atheism is incalculably more plausible than Christianity, is to indulge in philosophical nonsense that has no relevance whatsoever. Not only that, but it also makes a mockery of the actual reality of suffering. I mean, isn't Alex's suggestion that avoiding starvation is the reason why people like you and I eat, that is, people who have the luxury of watching hours of YouTube videos, a kind of a slap in the face of those who actually don't have enough to eat? All I'm saying is this, and I don't mean this in a sarcastic or rhetorical device kind of fashion, but I mean this with all honesty. I'm surprised that Alex, whom I highly respect and genuinely commend for both his intellectual sharpness and his compassion, would lack that much nuance in talking about the problem of suffering. Check out this more personal video to understand what I just said. Sure, there is pain in this world, and lots of it, but there is also pleasure and beauty, and lots of it too. Now, maybe you disagree with what I just said, and maybe you really do hold that you watching this video is a matter of you trying to escape the omnipresence of suffering that haunts you day and night. In the same vein, you might really hold that animals are constantly in pain, even defined by it. Fair enough. But what I'm almost 100% certain of is that Alex himself does not actually hold such an unbalanced position, even though he propagates it in his biggest case against Christianity. In fact, let me say this, if Alex, who entertains cosmic levels of skepticism, can claim that he knows as a matter of fact that the reason you are doing anything is because you think it will maximize your pleasure, then I think I'm warranted to claim with equal matter-of-fact certainty that Alex does not actually believe that most of your time spent existing is time spent trying to avoid suffering. If you didn't get this, just rewind the last 15 seconds, because it's kind of an important point. So, as it stands, I believe that Cosmic Skeptic has maneuvered himself into a cosmic dilemma, and he's got two options to get out of it. Option 1. Alex may stick with his biggest case against Christianity as it is and remain committed to the fictional picture of human and animal existence he has painted there. While the advantage of this option is that it allows him to fire a big shot against God with the atheist crowd cheering him on, it also opens him up to the charge that he is out of touch with the real world. The second problem with this option is that it directly opposes the foundation of Alex's very own ethical framework. Again, if it is true that sentient creatures are in constant pain, as Alex tells us in his case from animal suffering, then it's not true that they are primarily driven by the desire to maximize pleasure, as he claims in his theory of ethics. Option 2. Alex may modify his biggest case against Christianity and drop the one-sided ideas that animals are defined by pain and that suffering is omnipresent in his life, your life, and mine. He may admit that reality is far more complex and nuanced than what he made it to be, and affirm instead that humans and animals experience both pain and pleasure. The first benefit of this option is that it doesn't contradict Alex's ethical theory, because once you admit that sentient creatures are not in constant pain, the desire for the maximization of pleasure remains a candidate for the ultimate drive that guides human action. The second benefit of this option is that it would ground Alex's argument in the real rather than in a fictional world. The big challenge with this option is, of course, that it downsizes Alex's supposedly biggest case against Christianity considerably, as he has to admit that suffering is neither as defining nor as omnipresent as he made it out to be. In fact, the degree to which Alex's artificial layers of suffering are erased from his case is the degree to which Christianity picks up on plausibility. Remember, all other things being equal, the more intense the reality of suffering, the bigger the challenge for the Christian to defend his belief in the existence of an all-loving and all-powerful God, and the easier the task for the atheist to advance the argument that the existence of such a God is implausible. This also means that the less intense the reality of suffering, the easier the challenge for the Christian to defend his belief in the existence of an all-loving and all-powerful God, and the harder the task for the atheist to advance the argument that the existence of such a God is implausible. And here lies the real crux of the matter. Remember Alex's insight that some level of suffering is what we can expect to see if we assumed the existence of an all-loving and all-powerful God. This means that removing the fictional layers of suffering Alex added to reality involves the risk of ending up with a world whose actual level of suffering suddenly renders the existence of God plausible. So what's it gonna be, Alex? Are you gonna stick to an argument that is not only irrelevant to the world we live in, but even contradictory to the core conviction behind your own ethical theory? Or are you going to reframe your case in a way that places it in actual reality, even though it implies the risk of bumping into God as you do so? If you enjoyed this video, move over here to watch my first response to Alex's biggest case against Christianity and my response to his ethical theory. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to subscribe, and see you in the next one.